The Lone Ranger gave audiences immortal heroes, but in real life, many of its actors faced heartbreaking endings you wouldn't believe. From stars worn down by decades-long illnesses to sudden deaths in the middle of their careers, each story is a cut that leaves viewers silent. And once you learn what they endured after the glow of Western stardom faded, you will never look at this series the same way again. John Hart as the Lone Ranger. John Hart was born on December 13, 1917 in Los Angeles, California. In 1952, at 35 years old, he was chosen to replace Clayton Moore and became the masked face of the Lone Ranger for one season. The role elevated him to stardom, but it also opened the door to tragedy. Fans reacted harshly. Hate mail flooded his home, and Hart became an outcast in the very series that should have marked the peak of his life. That pressure quickly crushed a personal life already fragile from a previous divorce. When he met actress Beryl Braithwaite, marrying her just 10 days later, they believed love would save them both. But the death of their young daughter in 1960 shattered their world. Grief morphed into bitter arguments over money. Hart drank more and trapped himself in the belief that he was a failed Lone Ranger. As his career collapsed, he took stunt jobs and small roles in Hawkeye and The Last of the Mohicans and Jack Armstrong just to stay afloat, but nothing could repair the image that had crumbled in the public eye. The humiliation lingered for decades, wearing down his mental health until dementia began stealing his memory in the 2000s. Finally, John Hart died on January 20th, 2009, in Mexico, at 91 years old, no longer able to remember even his own name. His net worth at the end of his life was only about $1 million, a modest figure for a man who once wore one of television's most iconic masks, yet carried the fate of someone the industry forgot: Clayton Moore as the Lone Ranger. Clayton Moore was born on September 14, 1914, in Chicago, Illinois. At 35 years old, he stepped into the role of the Lone Ranger in 1949, and for 8 years, the masked hero became inseparable from his identity. But behind the bright spotlight, Moore's life spiraled through storms he never expected. His 3 marriages collapsed one after another like episodes in a long-running tragedy. The first ended under the strain of war and infidelity. The second broke down under the pressure of fame and a distance that could not be repaired. By the third marriage, he seemed close to peace, until degenerative eye disease slowly robbed him of his sight, forcing his wife into the role of caretaker. Dependents turned their love into hardship, and their final years into a cycle of painful arguments. The greatest drama erupted when Rather Corp. Sued him for wearing the Lone Ranger costume at public events. The ban, from 1979 to 1982, cut off nearly all his income. Moore withdrew from the public, battling depression alone. Chronic heart problems kept him in and out of the hospital, and the hero he played on screen became the only thing he held on to as his real life fell apart. Sadly, Clayton Moore died on December 28, 1999, of a heart attack in California at 85 years old. He was laid to rest at Forest Lawn Memorial Park. His net worth, adjusted to 2025 value, was approximately $5.5 million. J. Silverheels as Tonto. J. Silverheels was born on May 26, 1912, on the Six Nations Reserve in Ontario, Canada. At 37 years old, he became Tonto, the Lone Ranger's loyal companion, but also the role that trapped him inside a typecasting box for the rest of his life. The racism embedded in Hollywood roles made Silverheels feel constantly diminished, dismissed, and confined by an industry that never wanted to see a native actor stand shoulder to shoulder with white stars. That pressure seeped into his marriage with Mary D. Tom, who suffered from chronic diabetes and watched him fall into alcoholism as he tried to forget the humiliation of his career. Long nights of arguments and brief separations turned their home into a battlefield. When he founded the Indian Actors Workshop in 1971 to fight for Native representation, Hollywood pushed back. Money dried up, Subtle threats surfaced, and Silverheels carried yet another wound: disillusionment. But the price he paid was far too high. In 1976, he suffered a massive stroke that left him partially paralyzed, unable to speak clearly, and dependent on a wheelchair for the last 4 years of his life. J. Silverheels died on March 5, 1980, in Calabasas, California, at the age of 67, after a final stroke his body could no longer withstand. His ashes were returned to his homeland in 6 nations. His net worth at the time of his death was around $500,000, a modest sum for a man who spent his entire life fighting for Native people to be seen as fully human. Gerald Mohr as narrator. Gerald Mohr was born on June 11, 1914, in New York City, New York. At just 35 years old, he became the first narrator of The Lone Ranger in 1949, the voice that opened every episode and guided viewers into the legendary American West. But behind that strong baritone voice was a life burdened with pressure. His greatest tragedy came from the very marriage he fought to protect. The death of his son in an accident in 1955 sent both him and his wife Virginia into a spiral of grief. Mohr drank more, grew irritable, and sometimes left behind small emotional wounds of his own. By age 50, his health was faltering. His blood pressure rose, headaches became constant. Yet he kept working to support his family. Those close to him knew he was pushing himself past the breaking point, but no one could stop him. One evening in 1968, while filming in Stockholm, a sudden cerebral hemorrhage struck. He collapsed in front of the panicked crew, unable to speak any final words, and died just minutes later. Gerald Mohr passed away on November 9, 1968, in Stockholm at 54 years old, and was buried in Lidingö, Sweden, thousands of miles away from home. His net worth at the time was around $200,000, most of it earned from radio. Glenn Strange as Butch Cavendish. Glenn Strange was born on August 16, 1899, in Weed, New Mexico. At 50 years old, he took on the role of Butch Cavendish, the villain responsible for the Texas Rangers tragedy and one of the most haunting antagonists in The Lone Ranger, 1949. But behind the scenes, Strange was fighting a very different kind of battle. His marriage to Laura Kimlin lasted over 40 years and seemed unbreakable. But the deaths of their 3 sons in World War II crushed them both, leaving their home filled with silence rather than words. Strange carried that pain onto film sets, where he broke his leg, his back, and suffered chronic joint pain after years of doing his own stunts. By the 1970s, the worst arrived: terminal lung cancer after more than 50 years of smoking. Coughing blood, struggling to breathe, and unable to sleep from the agony, he was eventually forced to cancel his Gunsmoke shoots. Chemotherapy drained whatever hope remained, and he relied on heavy painkillers just to get through the day. Colleagues would later say, "Glenn didn't smile anymore, he was just trying to survive each day." Glenn Strange died on September 20, 1973, in Los Angeles, at 74 years old, after months of losing a brutal fight with lung cancer. He was buried at Forest Lawn, Hollywood Hills, beside many of the stars he had worked with throughout his long career. His net worth at the time was around $300,000, most of it earned from the hundreds of Western roles he performed in his lifetime. Chuck Courtney as Dan Reed. Chuck Courtney was born on July 23, 1930, in Los Angeles, California. In 1950, at just 19 years old, he played Dan Reed, the Lone Ranger's nephew, in 14 episodes and quickly became one of the young, iconic faces of the series. But the spotlight did not stay with him for long. Courtney's life veered into a direction even he could not pull himself back from. A childhood marked by physical abuse from his father left wounds that never healed, pushing Courtney toward alcoholism and uncontrollable bursts of anger. His first marriage to Judith collapsed after 15 years, destroyed by his self-destructive habits and the relentless pressure of working as a stuntman, which left him injured, unemployed, and drinking even more to escape his growing sense of failure. His second marriage to Barbara repeated the same tragedy. After losing his directing position on Bonanza due to injury, financial arguments and emotional exhaustion consumed their household. In 1999, a severe stroke left Courtney partially paralyzed. For someone who had lived through his body, who had thrown himself into some of Hollywood's most dangerous stunts, being immobilized felt like torture. He fell into deep depression, telling friends he felt useless, unnecessary, and no longer myself. Just 1 year later, in February 2000, Courtney shot himself to end what he called an unfixable pain. Chuck Courtney died on February 25, 2000, in North Hollywood at 69 years old, and his death shocked Hollywood. His net worth at the time was around $500,000, earned mostly through stunt work, directing, and a handful of late-career acting roles. Lane Bradford as Zeke. Lane Bradford was born on August 29, 1922, in New York. In 1949, at 27 years old, he played Zeke, one of the brutal henchmen who made the Lone Ranger's villains even more menacing. But Bradford's real life, unlike his hardened screen persona, was a long chain of heartbreak. His marriage to Charlotte in 1948 seemed stable at first, but the death of their young son in a car accident in 1960 destroyed her emotionally, leaving her in years-long depression and countless nights where the two had to avoid each other because Charlotte cried until she collapsed from exhaustion. Bradford tried to numb his grief with alcohol, which only made him irritable, volatile, and prone to car accidents that nearly killed him more than once. More than 200 horsefalls on film sets left him with accumulating head trauma, and Hollywood's tendency to typecast him as a bad guy meant unstable income and mounting debts that trapped the family in financial despair. Friends remembered his final years as those of a man worn down to the bone, suffering constant headaches, insomnia, and a fear that he would not have enough money to support his wife. Bradford often said he felt older than my real age, and his body truly was breaking down after decades of being hit, thrown, and injured for the camera. Lane Bradford collapsed while boating in Hawaii on June 6, 1973, and died just hours later at only 50 years old. The cause was a cerebral hemorrhage, believed to be the result of a lifetime of head injuries and alcohol abuse. His net worth at the time was just around $200,000, far too little for someone who had appeared in more than 250 productions. House Peters Jr. as Slim Gordon. House Peters Jr. was born on March 12, 1916, in Los Angeles, California. At 33 years old, he appeared in The Lone Ranger in 1949 as Slim Gordon, a minor character, yet one who left a strong impression thanks to his rugged demeanor and classic Western presence. But behind Slim's calm exterior was a life torn apart by losses too painful to put into words. His marriage to Micheline began in 1942, but in 1965, their son was killed in the Vietnam War. The shock sent Micheline into severe depression, while Peters Jr. spiraled into helplessness, unable to heal his wife's grief, or his own. At one point, they even separated temporarily because neither could bear living inside a home filled with so much sorrow. At the same time, his career slowed. Only small roles, villain parts, and unstable income that forced the family to take outside jobs just to get by. Old shoulder injuries from his days in serial films left him in chronic pain, yet he pushed himself to keep working. In his later years, Peters Jr. faced his greatest enemy, chronic pneumonia brought on by age and decades of heavy smoking. By 2008, he was in and out of the hospital, dependent on a ventilator, battling waves of pain so intense he once admitted, "Every breath feels like a knife cutting into my chest." Still, Micheline remained at his side, though she too struggled under the weight of grief that had shadowed their marriage for decades. House Peters Jr. died on October 1, 2008, at the Motion Picture and Television Fund Hospital, at the age of 92. His net worth at the time of his death was estimated at about $1 million, earned mostly from the countless supporting roles he had faithfully carried for more than 3 decades. Mickey Simpson as Lefty. Mickey Simpson was born on December 4, 1913 in Los Angeles, California. At 36 years old, he played Lefty, a brutal henchman who frequently clashed with the hero and helped set the intense tone of the Lone Ranger in 1949. But behind the towering frame and fearsome presence was a heart worn down by the blows life and Hollywood kept throwing at him. His marriage to Audrey, beginning in 1940, was overshadowed by endless storms. Alcoholism made Simpson angry, volatile, and at times violent, forcing the couple to separate multiple times. The death of his brother in a film set accident in 1950 shattered him further, drowning him in guilt and trauma that clung to him for decades. Over his career, he appeared in more than 150 westerns and worked as a stuntman in countless scenes involving horse falls, fistfights, and dragging stunts, leaving his chest aching every time he took a deep breath. By the 1970s, doctors diagnosed him with chronic heart failure, requiring daily medication just to survive. But as work dried up, silence became the last thing he had left. In his final years, Mickey Simpson lived in near isolation. Retirement meant the loss of income and the loss of purpose. Friends recalled that he rarely left his home, spending most days sitting in a dim living room, listening to the slow, fading rhythm of his own heartbeat. That loneliness, coupled with the financial hardship that followed him after Hollywood, turned him into a shadow of the man he once was. Mickey Simpson died on September 23, 1985, in Northridge, California, at 71 years old, due to heart failure. He was buried at Forest Lawn, Hollywood Hills. His net worth at the time of his death was estimated at about $400,000. John Doucette, as Andrew Gage. John Doucette was born on February 21, 1921, in Brockton, Massachusetts. At 28 years old, he took on the role of Andrew Gage, one of the series' familiar villainous faces, known for his deep voice and icy stare, in The Lone Ranger in 1949. But Doucette's real life was nowhere near as tough as the menacing characters he played on screen. His marriage to Faye, which began in 1948, was shaken by financial pressures and his long-term struggle with alcoholism. In 1960, they temporarily divorced after Doucette became increasingly unstable, especially following a serious car accident in 1955 when he drove drunk and shattered his leg. That leg never fully healed, leaving him in constant pain and deeply embarrassed when roles required strenuous movement. In 1990, the final tragedy struck: metastasized prostate cancer. Doucette spent the last 4 years of his life enduring painful chemotherapy, muscle wasting, and the despair of knowing he no longer had the strength to stand in front of a camera. Forced to retire, he lived his final years in silence, watching his health collapse and his career end just when he still longed to work. John Doucette died on April 16, 1994, in Banning, California, at 73 years old after a long battle with cancer. He was laid to rest at Holy Cross Cemetery in Culver City. His net worth at death was estimated at about $800,000, largely earned from the nearly 300 films and series he appeared in. Harvey as mayor. Harvey was born on December 20, 1901, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. At 48 years old, he appeared as the mayor, a small but grounding presence whose naturalism added authenticity to the earliest episodes of The Lone Ranger in 1949. But behind that modest screen time lay a life that endured far more than Hollywood ever noticed. His only marriage, to Lillian, lasted from 1925 until 1960, when she died suddenly of heart disease. The loss devastated Harvey and plunged him into suffocating loneliness. Friends said he would sit for hours in his dark kitchen just to listen to old radio recordings of her voice. The tragedy didn't stop there. A film set accident in the 1940s blinded him in one eye, forcing him to accept smaller parts or turn to radio work just to survive. His career, steady but lacking recognition, was built almost entirely on nameless supporting roles, a reality that burdened him with quiet resentment for the rest of his life. In his later years, Harvey lived quietly, without spotlight or red carpets, only old age and memories that never healed. Friends recalled that in his final years, he rarely left his home because everything reminded him of Lillian, and everything hurt. Long after Hollywood forgot him, Harvey continued accepting any role he could, as if acting were the only thing still tethering him to the world. Harry Harvey died quietly on November 26, 1985, at 84 years old. His cause of death was never officially disclosed, but many believe age and long-standing illness had simply worn his body down. He left behind a legacy of more than 300 roles, spanning half a century. His net worth at the time of his death was around $300,000, equivalent to about $800,000 in 2025. Richard Crane as sheriff. Richard Crane was born on June 6, 1918 in Newcastle, Pennsylvania. He played the sheriff in The Lone Ranger in 1949 when he was just 31 years old, bringing to the screen a stern, justice-driven lawman. But in real life, Crane was a man crushed far too early and far too mercilessly by life itself. His marriage to Mary, which began in 1945, carried cracks that no studio lights could hide. In 1955, an infidelity scandal led to a temporary separation, and in 1960, their only daughter died from a severe illness. After her death, Crane fell into deep depression, becoming a withdrawn figure who avoided nearly all conversation. His career fared no better. The failure of Rocky Jones, Space Ranger in 1954, cost him both status and confidence, and Crane began accepting any role he could just to survive. Adding to his troubles was chronic back pain caused by stunt work, painful enough that even standing in front of the camera became an ordeal. By the late 1960s, friends said Crane looked at least 10 years older than his real age. Heavy smoking and an unhealed heartbreak wore down his heart rapidly. He tried to hide his worsening condition, but anyone watching him on set could see his hands trembling and his movements slowing. His spirit grew increasingly fragile, and the loneliness that followed his daughter's death left him unable to find his way back to normal life. Richard Crane died suddenly of a heart attack on January 9, 1969, at just 50 years old, far too young. He was laid to rest at Valhalla Memorial Park Cemetery, leaving behind the sorrow of those who believed he deserved a much greater career. His net worth at the time of his death was $1.6 million in 2025. William Challee as Bad Eye Dixon. William Challee was born on April 6, 1904, in Chicago, Illinois. At 45 years old, he appeared in The Lone Ranger, 1949, as Bad Eye Dixon, a calculating villain whose cold stare carried the exhaustion of a man who had seen too much darkness. But Challee's real-life tragedy dwarfed any role he ever played. His long marriage to Virginia seemed solid, but after their son was killed in World War II in 1944, their family life collapsed completely. Challee fell into severe depression and began drinking heavily, to the point that he lost radio work early in his career, placing the family in financial instability. He tried to keep acting, but the grief of losing a child turned him into a man oscillating between moments of clarity and drunken escape, working relentlessly one day just to avoid thinking, then crumbling the next. His roles in Gunsmoke and The Red Pony did nothing to mend a heart that had already been shattered. The 1980s became a true nightmare for Challee. Alzheimer's disease began eroding his mind, stealing memories he desperately tried to hold on to. Eventually, he lost all recognition, unable to identify friends, colleagues, or even the partner who had stayed by his side through every devastating chapter. At the nursing home, he often woke in a panic, screaming the name of his son who had died more than 40 years earlier. The hallucinations, fear, and mental deterioration turned the final years of his life into an unending descent. William Challee died from Alzheimer's complications on March 3, 1989, at 84 years old. He was laid to rest at Alta Mesa Memorial Park in Palo Alto. His net worth at the time of his death was $900,000 in 2025, modest for a man who spent his entire life working in stage, film, and television. Robert Kellard as Jim. Robert Kellard was born on October 22, 1915, in New York. At 34 years old, he joined the Lone Ranger in 1949 as Jim, a young, strong, heroic figure full of spirit. But behind that rugged exterior was a life steeped in loss, illness, and private pain the public never saw. His marriage to Ruth lasted more than 4 decades, yet it existed under the shadow of unbearable tragedy. Their 2 children died from illness, one after the other, shattering Kellard's spirit in the truest sense. After that, he became withdrawn, quieter, and weighed down by a sorrow that never lifted. The pressures of Hollywood only deepened the emotional wounds. The serials he starred in throughout the 1950s repeatedly flopped, leaving behind a sense of humiliation and a quiet depression that followed him for the rest of his life. Chronic shoulder injuries from his years in action-heavy serials caused constant pain and limited mobility, yet Kellard pushed on, performing as though his body had never been damaged. As he moved into middle age, Kellard's life became a slow, quiet descent. Heavy smoking, emotional exhaustion, and the hollow ache left by his family's tragedies sent his health spiraling. Friends remembered him saying, "Hollywood gave me a chance, but it also took everything I had," a sentence that revealed how deeply the industry had both shaped and scarred him. His career stalled, roles dwindled, and over time he faded into obscurity, struggling with illness, fading finances, and a profound loneliness inside the small home where he spent most of his final years. Robert Kellard died of acute pneumonia on September 12, 1981, at just 65 years old. He passed away quietly and without warning, as though his life had only enough breath left to close a long, painful chapter. His net worth at the time of his death was around $1 million, a modest ending for a man who once stood before the camera filled with belief, ambition, and the hope that Hollywood would carry him somewhere brighter. They may be gone, but their stories remain. Fragile, heartbreaking, and haunting. Which of these deaths do you think was the most unfair? And who deserves to be remembered more? Leave a comment below and don't forget to subscribe so we can continue uncovering the stories time tried to erase.